The object of Dodecagon is to move your pawns around 3 concentric rings of 12 spaces to the center of the board. The player who does this first wins the game. First, let's take a look at the game board. The shape on the playing surface is a dodecagon, that is a 12-sided geometric figure. There are 3 concentric rings, each with 12 spaces. There are 4 different colored safety zones corresponding to the pawns of the same color. For example, the green safety zone is safe only for green pawns. Along the right edge of each safety zone between the rings are openings called ring drops. Ring drops are used to move your pawns from an outer ring to an inner ring toward the center of the board. Of course, green pawns can only use green ring drops, blue ring drops, and so on. An arm called the sweeper extends across the diameter of the playing surface. At the center of the 3 rings is a space called the home space. Stack your pawns on the start circle and move them to the finish circle after they reach the home space at the center of the board. Move your pawns into play on the black space next to your start circle and to the left of your safety zone. And now, here are the rules. While learning the game, each player should use 3 pawns. Once you understand the rules and strategies, begin with 4 or 5 or even 6 pawns. The more pawns you use, the more challenging the game and the longer it will take. Place your pawns at the start space corresponding to your color. Roll the dice to see who begins. Highest roll starts the game. The sweeper should be placed along a line between 2 safety zones. Advancing your pawns. Roll the dice and move your pawns in a clockwise manner as follows. Move 1 pawn the total of both dice, or move 1 pawn the total of 1 die, and a 2nd pawn the total of the 2nd die. A pawn or pawns must be moved the total of the dice except to win the game when the total of 1 or both can be used. If a player still has 1 or more pawns in the start space, at least 1 pawn must be moved into play on each roll of the dice before any other pawns can be moved. Anytime doubles are rolled, the player goes again. However, if snake eyes is rolled, the player moves the sweeper 2 spaces in one direction and loses his or her turn. Moving the sweeper. Anytime a 1 shows up, the sweeper is advanced 1 space in either direction, sending any pawns on those spaces back to their start space, except those pawns that are in their safety zone. The player moves his or her pawn the total of the 2nd die. The player may move either the sweeper or the pawn first. Pawns can never be moved on a 1. If 2 1s are thrown, snake eyes, the player moves the sweeper 2 spaces in the same direction and passes the dice to the next player. Stacking. Only 1 pawn can rest on the surface of any 1 space. If a pawn lands on a space occupied by another pawn, it must be placed on top of that pawn. If another pawn lands on that space, it is placed on top of both pawns. It is possible for all the pawns to be stacked on 1 space in this fashion. Only the pawns on top or on the bottom of the stack may be moved. Pawns between the top and the bottom pawns are trapped and cannot be advanced. When the pawn on the bottom of the stack of 2 or more pawns is advanced, it must carry all the pawns on top along with it. If all a player's pawns are trapped, he or she continues to roll the dice, but can only advance the sweeper. If doubles are thrown, he or she may roll again, but cannot advance any pawns. If opponent's pawns are on top of another player's pawn when it enters the home space, the opponent's pawns are sent back to the start space. Ring drops. A player can only move his or her pawns through the ring drops connected to the safety zone of his or her color and advance into the next ring. A player's pawns can either be carried past their ring drop or carried through the ring drop of an opponent when they are stacked on top of that opponent. Pawns can be moved around the third inner ring as often as a player wishes. Safety zones. Players have a safety zone for their pawns. The color of their safety zone is identical to the color of their pawns. When pawns are in the safety zone, they cannot be swept off the board. If they are in a stack of pawns and the sweeper moves across the space, their pawns remain in the safety zone while all other pawns in the stack are swept back to their start space. Winning the game. A player has won when all his or her pawns have entered the home space and been removed from the board. A player's pawns enter the home space if one or both of the dice thrown are the exact number needed to go through the last ring drop and into the home space. A player with one pawn left must move around and around and around the last ring until he or she rolls the exact number needed to enter the home space and win the game.